It's always a treat to be at Emory, and I'm delighted to be back here. I really enjoyed my year. As some of you probably remember, I didn't want to leave. I think people were pushing me. And I also want to recognize Worth Long, who just walked in. And he is my first SNCC teacher. And I'm hoping that he'll have something to say before we're done today. I'm glad he made it in the rain. So today I'm going to move around a little bit, and I'm probably going to sort of go over some of the same territory or some of the same time frame more than once. And I'm undoubtedly going to start forgetting that everybody doesn't know this as well as I do, so please stop me. And I realized as I was putting this together that I started getting ambitious about all the little tidbits that I've been thinking about, so you all can work through this with me. Any discussion of women in SNCC or SNCC generally should probably start with Ella Baker. Okay, I guess I need help. So this is going to involve hand-eye coordination too. So anything on SNCC should start with Miss Baker. And she's the person who called the sit-in students, sit-in leaders together in April of 1960, where they formed the temporary Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But unfortunately, the story usually centers around 1964 summer project known as Freedom Summer in Mississippi and the November 1964 position paper on women written by two white staffers, Mary King and Casey Hayden. They shared their paper at a staff retreat in Waveland, Mississippi during a period of intense turmoil and uncertainty as the organization tried to regroup following Freedom Summer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenge. King's and Hayden's roughly two-page paper asserted that men controlled most of the organization's decision-making, listed a handful of examples where male leadership was assumed, and charged that women were typically limited to stereotypical female work. I don't actually want you to read it. You can go online and find it. They also contended that many women were unhappy with, quote, assumptions of male superiority, and moreover, that the movement was wasting much talent and experience by not giving women, quote, jobs commensurate with their abilities. Although the two women submitted the paper anonymously, their identity was quickly well known, and at the end of a long, tense day of discussion, Stokely Carmichael poked fun both at the authors and the larger SNCC community, asserting playfully that, quote, the position of women in SNCC was prone. Everybody know what Stokely's talking about, passive sexual position for women, and he's making a joke about the preoccupation that many segregationists had with interracial sex in the movement, and the fact that this is young people. The fact that the two women who wrote this position paper were white in an organization that was Black-founded, Black-led, and majority Black has some significance, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if anyone's interested. Over time, the position paper, taken together with the distorted account of Carmichael's quip and disproportionate attention to the experiences of Freedom Summer's white female volunteers, has formed the backdrop for most discussions and analysis of SNCC women's experiences. In some circles, it's widely accepted that sexism in SNCC was particularly egregious and, as such, a critical impetus for the women's liberation movement. This is pretty ironic because, in fact, SNCC was the movement organization most receptive to women's participation and influence. And there are lots of reasons for that, I think, but Ella Baker is one of the most important. But regardless of what you believe about SNCC, this focus on the position paper, Freedom Summer, and Carmichael has really shaped how people talk about it. There's very little scholarly attention to what happened in SNCC after these moments, or certainly with women, and in general, after 66, there's very little. And most discussions of the earlier period in the organization, as I said, are framed by this popular narrative of SNCC as sexist and structured as a response to these events. SNCC women have been outspoken about their experiences in the organization, and even those who acknowledge the existence of male bias tend to emphasize their positive experiences. In the late 1980s, for example, Joyce Ladner responded forcefully to what she considered the simplistic and problematic framings by white feminists, and insisted that SNCC, quote, gave us the first structured opportunity to use our skills in an egalitarian way, without any kind of subjugation because of our race or our class or our gender. Bernice Johnson Regan maintained that in SNCC, quote, the structure of the organization was such that you were the only person who could limit what you did, and you had to find the courage to challenge anything that didn't feel right to you. This type of analysis is common among women who served on SNCC staff, including the position paper authors Mary King and Casey Hayden, who have repeatedly pointed to the importance of Ella Baker as mentor and role model, and insisted that their critique of the organization's male bias was shaped more by their positive experiences than their negative, so that they had so much opportunity that when they ran into a barrier, it was more noticeable, so that it's this contradiction that they're responding to, whereas since there were no women in SCLC, that couldn't even be raised there. I mean, it's a slight exaggeration, but not much. At the same time, it's important to remember that SNCC was founded in the context of a sexist and patriarchal society. This inevitably influenced the organization and the people in it. We can add nuance to it, but at a fundamental level, that's the overriding context. And for the younger folks here, it's important to remember that in 1960, when SNCC was founded, job discrimination based on gender and race was still legal. It wasn't outlawed until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You had separate male and female want ads. Women faced quotas and barriers in colleges and throughout society. Male pronouns were typically used for all people. So the Civil Rights Act of 64 opened up space in a lot of ways. And so I probably wouldn't have this job if it weren't for the Civil Rights Act of 64. So if I take as a starting point, as a given, that SNCC was both sexist and empowering, then I want to ask different questions, not is it or was it, or how do those go back and forth, but why was SNCC so open to women in contrast to other spaces in society? How did women and men create and negotiate this space? What barriers did women continue to face? What were the patterns, and how did things vary depending on context, like working in the Atlanta office versus out in the field in Mississippi? How did race play into this? Education, whether you were from the North or the South. So instead of writing the history backwards from 1964, I'm starting with the sit-ins and moving forward. One of the important things this does is recenter Black women. The critique of sexism has been widely seen as a white women's issue. There were very real differences related to Black and white women's roles in the organization, but I think that the way these issues are often connected is more complicated than that. And again, that's something I can talk about more. So for today's presentation, I'm focusing primarily on the first 2 years of SNCC, and I'm including the sit-in movement as the beginning of SNCC, and going through to some of the first forays into organizing in communities in Southwest Georgia and Mississippi. And I'll jump around a little bit past that here and there. But first, I want to take one last look at 1964. This photo is from Atlanta SNCC office in January of 1964. I don't know if you can read the signs. Can you read the signs? So, yeah, Judy Richardson, front left as you face. Her sign says unfair. Ruby Doris Robinson also in the front to the right. No more work till justice comes to the Atlanta office, I think it says. The others are a little harder for me to read. But according to the women in this sit-in, one of the issues that they were raising was the fact that only women were expected to take minutes in the organization. And since the organization believed in a lot of discussion and trying to reach consensus, And there was some intense 4-day, all-night discussions. This meant lots and lots of typing. Judy Richardson says that she, wrote in shorthand, and she was so impressed with SNCC people, she wrote down everything they said. And she showed me a little diary that she had, and it's like day after day, it's like working on minutes, typing minutes, still typing minutes. It's like, And so that's one of the issues for this sit-in. But think about the timing. This is January 1964, and the Waveland position papers come out in November of 64, almost a year later. And look at the race of the women in this picture, what you can tell. How many white women are in this picture? Yeah, Mary King. And so if you look at this, it flips entirely the idea that only white women were identifying and critiquing these issues of gendered distribution of labor in the organization. And so I think that it doesn't change the fact that, racial positioning is important in that, but it means we have to think about it more carefully. And also, if you're interested, you can read a version of the sit-in in one of Jim Foreman's, I think it's the second edition and past that, of Making of Black Revolutionaries, where he says that he encouraged the women to do this and use him for role play, and they're not buying it. And one of the things that I started doing was saying to Judy and other people, well, after you had the sit-in, what happened with the minutes? And Judy's like, well, the men dealt with it not because they thought it was, they had to deal with it, so they dealt with it. I said, well, which men took minutes? Of course, I can go look at the minutes. Some of them say, some of them don't. But she couldn't remember, so I started asking, and the first person that gave me an answer was Julian Bond. And he said the man that he remembered taking minutes was Jimmy Bolton, who was office manager in Atlanta office for a while. And then Julian added, and he was gay. And so I came back to Atlanta and I told Worth this story. And Worth built on that, and he's, oh man. The other man that he could remember taking minutes was Sandy Lee, and he was gay. So by January 1965, you actually see men and women, lots of people involved in taking minutes. There's a big meeting at ITC, and I think, minutes by committee. And I've found some earlier minutes where it's almost all men in the room, and one woman, Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, and she was not the person taking minutes. One of the men was taking minutes. And so it's an interesting lens for looking at some of this. A little bit of a distraction, but an interesting one. So SNCC was born out of the sit-in movement, and the group's earliest leaders emerged from the campus-based protests. Women and men alike joined the sit-ins, and there was no consistent pattern of either male or female numerical predominance in those challenging the lunch counter segregation. However, men were more likely than women to be identified as leaders, holding elected positions and serving as official spokespersons. Even in the absence of formal leadership, men were more likely to sign documents, shape strategy, and have a disproportionate impact on decision-making. To some extent, this mirrors the roles that men were already playing on campus. In addition to dominating the elected positions in student government, they were often among the most visible and popular students, leading fraternities and starring on athletic teams. And you see a little bit of this with women who, or at least I've found at Albany State, two of the women that were very involved had been Miss Albany. So there's a little bit of a parallel, but it's not as strong among women. Though some of these traditional campus leaders moved seamlessly into the sit-in leadership, many others were reluctant. So people often looked to the traditional leadership as a starting place. So when Ella Baker sent letters inviting people to come to the SNCC founding meeting, if she didn't have names based on newspaper articles or contacts, she would just send it to SGA, student government. Women were among those who emerged as new leaders, moving into the openings created when the traditional leaders hesitated or when the students found that they weren't doing the job. With the sit-ins and the movement more generally, one's actions became more important than one's status. For the young people propelling the sit-ins forward, gender norms were just one of the inherited expectations that the emerging movement began to challenge or ignore. In general, the more people available to join a sit-in, the more successful it would be. As a result, whether planners were a handful in a room full, or a handful or a room full, they needed maximum participation, and overt gender bias was a luxury they could ill afford. In the heat of the moment, whether confronting a white merchant, defying a police officer, or engaging a black dean, students recognized and responded to the clarity and bravery of their peers, regardless of gender. The risks associated with participation, coupled with respect for action, opened up space. So women moved into this space, but they also helped create it. So it's a dynamic thing going on, I think. And in taking on lunch counter segregation, the sit-inners set in motion a whole series of intended and unintended challenges. Although many sit-in students had important older mentors, professors, family members, sometimes NAACP youth advisors, they almost uniformly rejected the advice of their elders when it was aimed at slowing them down or directing them away from protest. They were clearly confronting segregation and white authority, but their use of direct action was also an implicit and sometimes explicit rejection of the established civil rights organizations and the tentative status quo worked out between black administrators and white elites. Students typically acted without parental permission and in defiance of campus rules. Students took these steps despite the very real possibility that they might be attacked or arrested and that they might lose scholarships or be expelled. Bernice Johnson Reagan gives this example, I heard her talk in a presentation a couple years ago, and she said that when students were leading a march from Albany State College, the leaders of the march were two young women, she and her best friend, Annette Jones, and she said they were leading the march, two girls, she said, or two females, because they were the clearest of the students. But she says they were able to do that because three male SNCC field secretaries were walking in front and alongside and on the other side of them, so providing this protection, but they're stepping forward. And then she continued and she talked about after doing this march, landing at one of the local churches, the only place that they could go, she's asked to sing a song and she flips the words in a sacred song. And she's like, never occurred to me I could even do that before. But the moment required something like that. She also talked about how her parents immediately gathered up their other children, her siblings, and kept them under lock and key. You know, we've lost one, we're not going to lose the others. But as she goes through it, you see all of the things that she's having to push against. Before the semester's over, she's expelled. She's, has parents who keep close track, and she's defied what they want her to do. In that context, the fact that she's also doing something outside of the expected gender relations is just one, or gender roles is just one more little piece of that larger challenge. So if you look at a few snapshots from local sit-ins, they illustrate some of these points. On February 1st, 1960, 4 male freshmen initiated the Greensboro and Southwide wave of sit-in. Upon their triumphant return to campus after sitting in most of the afternoon at a downtown Woolworths, they recruited an all-male group of sit-in leaders from fraternities and student government to coordinate subsequent protests. By the second day, women, including some from the nearby Women's College Bennett, had joined the sit-in, and Ezell Blair, one of the Greensboro Four, later observed that within 2 months, protest leaders, quote, could not get the fellows out, and girls were doing most of the picketing. So this was for the boycott that went with the sit-ins. A Bennett sociology professor interviewed in 1961 also thought that Bennett women were, quote, carrying the movement, and added that, quote, A&T fellows have complained that the Bennett girls dominate them. He further explained that, quote, girls sometimes give in or flatter the boys in order to get a small group from A&T to work with them. No doubt because of their central role in sustaining the protest, when some Bennett women demanded a voice in the decision-making, they were added to the leadership framework, along with, quote, girls from other area schools. In this instance, demanding a voice, they were operating from a position of strength, since without them, the movement would collapse. The Atlanta student movement was initiated when Morehouse student, veteran, and football star Lonnie King read about the Greensboro protest and immediately recruited Julian Bond and Joseph Pierce, both of whom were in the same coffee shop at the moment or drugstore. They organized a preliminary meeting, and when the 6 presidents of the Atlanta University colleges got wind of their effort, they tried to slow the new activist momentum by calling a meeting and then saying that before they sat in, they should write a statement of why they were sitting in. So they did that. And though all of the first group of student leaders in the Atlanta University Center and 5 of the 6 Student Government Association presidents were men, it was the lone female, Rosalind Pope, part of the group because she was Spelman's student government president, who took the lead with Julian Bond on drafting what became the Appeal on Human Rights, this statement. It was expected that the 6 presidents, 5 men and 1 woman, and she was the president of all-female Spelman, would sign the document. But when it came time, the Morris Brown student government president was reluctant. He was afraid he would lose a scholarship if whites in his hometown learned of his activism. And so the female secretary at Morris Brown immediately stepped up and signed it, Marianne Smith, and who's also older sister of Ruby Doris Smith Robinson. And I think that this is important. The men who signed the document did so because of the traditional leadership position they were in, and people went to them as student government presidents. Marianne Smith was in the one position you would see women generally in student government of secretary. And I was going to say, the minute that you see a crack, she moves through it. I think she probably helped create that little space. And Rosalind Pope and Julian Bond also told me that while they were working on this statement, at the very last minute, they were meeting at Howard Zinn's house. And Julian Bond was sitting there at the typewriter pecking away while Rosalind Pope was dictating edits. And that also reverses, I think, the usual picture. Over the subsequent weeks and months in Atlanta, Lonnie King was the undisputed leader, and many of the other named leaders were also men. But the strongest participants and people that had a strong impact on decision-making were women. Morris Brown's Marianne Smith, Rosalind Pope, Marian Wright, later Marian Wright Edelman, Spelman's Herschel Sullivan, all 3 of those women were from Spelman, are among those that took a really central role in the Atlanta student movement. And like their counterparts at Bennett, they did the work of staffing the office, developing the plans, and attending to what Ella Baker called the spade work, while also marching in demonstrations and spending time in jail. I can't say this conclusively, but looking at everything I've been able to find, it seems clear that Spelman students dominated disproportionately participated in demonstrations, disproportionately went to jail. It doesn't look like that everywhere, but that part of what's important is looking how these pieces play out. When I first interviewed Julian Bond and I was asking him to describe some of the people involved, he kept describing the women as serious. And he sort of noticed what he was doing after a moment and thought that maybe it reflected on the fact that they didn't think he was taking it as seriously as he needed to. But he was sort of thinking about, I think, Marianne Smith and Rosalind Pope in particular. Diane Nash was one of the first and most visible women to step forward with the early sit-ins and student movement. I'm going to stick with Diane Nash for a little bit, give you a bit of a profile of her, and then I'm going to come back over some of this territory again and look at some of the things I see around that. Diane Nash is she's used as a piece of evidence to argue that SNCC was sexist because she was never elected chair of the organization despite her obvious leadership, and also evidence of the organization's openness to women because she was so obviously a leader. So people go very different directions with that one. Despite the attention she's been given, I think both camps fail to recognize how central she was to early SNCC's history and what factors changed that. Nash was among the extraordinary cadre of student activists who came out of Jim Lawson's workshops on nonviolence in Nashville. In a 1973 interview, Ella Baker asserted that Nash, quote, was kind of unique among women in the early stages of the sit-in movement. She was there at its decisive stages, and she was in a leadership role, a public leadership role. When the Greensboro sit-ins started, Lawson's group had already spent considerable time learning and role-playing nonviolence. They conducted test sit-ins before the winter break, and they were clearly the group best prepared to carry out sustained sit-ins. Even within this extraordinary group, which included future SNCC chairs Marion Barry and John Lewis, along with Jim Bevel, Nash, and Bernard Lafayette, all of whom made their mark in the larger movement, when it came time to choose someone to head the Nashville Central Committee as the sit-in started, two traditional campus leaders, including campus NAACP branch president, initially, quote, maneuvered themselves into position. Jim Bevel reflected that they were considered leaders because they came with traditional credentials. After first one man and then the other was asked to resign after missing meetings and demonstrations, Diane Nash emerged as the group's consensus choice to replace them. She was drafted as chair despite her considerable reluctance. Later, she recalled trying repeatedly to turn down the job, explaining that she was afraid, both of being arrested and of letting down her fellow demonstrators. Though Nash's leadership is widely acknowledged and praised, particularly among those who worked with her, almost every mention of Nash starts with and emphasizes her physical attributes and past history as a high school beauty queen. Colleague John Lewis, for example, writes, quote, she was one of God's beautiful creatures, just about the most gorgeous woman any of us had ever seen, small and shapely, with honey brown skin and bright green eyes. She had won more than her share of beauty pageants as a young teen, and I could give you like 10 pages of quotes just like that. In June 1961, Nash was on the cover of Jet magazine, which did a good job recognizing her leadership as, quote, one of the unheralded members of the brain trust that is making the Freedom Ride movement a well-coordinated operation. The article also described her as an, quote, attractive, comely co-ed, who was a former runner-up in a Chicago Miss America contest. Despite this overemphasis on Nash's physical appeal, her leadership is more fully and realistically explained by her many skills and emerging vision. In a recent interview, colleague Bernard Lafayette explained that Nash was, quote, an English major, very articulate, persuasive, and calm, with an exceptional ability to synthesize information and help the group reach consensus. Angeline Butler, another Nashville student activist, explained in 1961 that Nash was someone, quote, who can get kids to think the way she does. She is so interested and so well organized. She stays up late at night planning the agenda. In the dorm, she talked to other students and developed ideas. John Lewis, after noting that he and the other men gradually came to see Nash as a, quote, sister rather than the object of romantic desire, added that she was an ideal leader because she was very calm, very deliberate, always straightforward and sincere. From the vantage point of today, it's easy to recognize Nash's effectiveness. In retrospect, she seems an obvious choice for leadership, especially when you factor in some of her high-profile successes. For example, when a well-known attorney's house was bombed in Nashville and students quickly organized a silent march downtown, Nash was among the speakers, and following the precepts of nonviolence, she asked Nashville Mayor Ben West if, as a man, he thought segregation was right. In response to her question, he agreed with the sit-in students that lunch counters should desegregate, a moment many people see as the turning point in the Nashville sit-ins. Ella Baker credits Nash with effectively articulating for SNCC and other students the need for, quote, mass arrests accompanied by the tactic of jail, no bail. So as SNCC started to escalate the demonstrations, those students. When SNCC decided to support Friendship College students utilizing jail, no bail in Rock Hill, South Carolina on the first anniversary of the sit-ins, Nash was one of the 4 SNCC students, 2 of them women, who courted arrest and then served 30 days, the full sentence. Marion Smith Robinson had also volunteered to be one of those students, but by the time she got home and spent a little time at home, her younger sister had badgered her until Ruby Doris replaced her older sister on that. Although the Atlanta students carried out their own jail no bail effort, enthusiastically supported by Spelman students, overall the strategy failed to take off. I'm not sure if I said Nash and the others spent 30 days in jail in Rock Hill, the men out on the road gang and the women in their cells. Though unsuccessful in sparking a second wave of sit-ins with jail-ins, SNCC's decision to send workers to jail in Rock Hill was an important step in the organization's move from a loose association of protest groups sharing information toward a full-time organization of full-time organizers. The Rock Hill arrests and jail time also marked the end of Diane Nash's efforts to juggle school and the movement. Though she was a second semester senior, she recalled that after spending a month in jail, quote, the Chaucer classes became unbearable. And she believed, quote, the movement needed the services of a full-time person. A few other students had taken jobs for civil rights organizations after graduating or being expelled, but I believe Nash may have been the first to choose to leave school for the movement, and she spent the rest of the spring semester dividing her time between the Nashville Student Movement and the Nashville affiliate of SCLC, Christian Leadership Conference. There you go. By this time, in spring of 1961, SNCC was trying to get a student to work as a field secretary to travel around to different places, and they tried a number of times to convince Nash to take that job. She refused, probably because she was so immersed in Nashville and the SNCC job was not very well defined. Nash was the key person in Nashville when CORE, reeling from vicious attacks in Alabama and under pressure from the Kennedys, considered calling off the Freedom Rides. It was Nash more than anyone else who insisted that the rides must continue, that violence could not be allowed to stop the movement. She quickly began rallying students to make the journey to Montgomery to carry the rides forward. As the students made plans, they turned again to Nash, asking her to stay behind and coordinate. She recalls later that being on the Freedom Rides Coordinating Committee was terrifying because lives were at stake. In that position, Nash was steadfast in the face of adult skepticism and the unrelenting pressure generated by the Kennedys. She directed the resumption of the rides from Nashville and then relocated to Jackson, Mississippi when it became clear that most participants would be arrested and released there. In addition to helping with logistics, she began holding nonviolent workshops and organizing support among local Mississippians. It's also interesting, too, because Nash is doing all this within the context of the sit-in movement, but when the violence really explodes in Alabama, King flies into Montgomery, and he's in a church. There's a mass meeting, and you probably can visualize this from Eyes on the Prize, but there's a mob outside, and people have to stay inside half the night before it's safe to leave. While this is going on, King is on the phone trying to negotiate with Kennedy, but it's challenging because Nash is the one who's calling the shots, or at least she's the one who has influence with the students. So in the student context, she's listened to, but once it jumps up a little bit, everybody assumes that King is the leader. Throughout the spring and summer of 1961, Nash was really a central player in SNCC as people began to talk about the need to leave school and put off jobs to work full-time. Obviously, as I said, she already made this decision for herself, so she serves as kind of a model on that. But SNCC also began discussing the possibility of moving into voter registration, which some people saw as moving away from direct action. And Nash, in this context, was very opposed to that move to voter registration for a variety of reasons. She thought that direct action had worked well. She thought it was more moral. She saw the voter registration as politics and inherently corrupt. But she was also particularly worried because the Kennedys were pushing that. And having seen what happened on the Freedom Ride, she was a little concerned that they would then be able to control the movement, especially when one of the things that the Attorney General and or his lawyers said to the young students was that if they had trouble with their draft board as they dropped out of school, that they would handle that. So she thought that that was another way that they might be captive to the Kennedys. So there was a lot of debate about this, and it came to a head in a big meeting in August 1961 at Highlander, where the organization almost split into two groups before Ella Baker convinced them to stay together and have two wings, one for voter registration, one for direct action. Nash was selected to head the direct action wing, and she was also very much the person who galvanized that position and recruited the others who held it. I'm not going to go into this, go into what happens next in terms of that debate, except to say that within a couple months, as SNCC began working in Macomb on voter registration and Nash went to Jackson, or stayed in Jackson working on direct action, it quickly became clear that voter registration was as direct an action, I think, as somebody said, as you could take in Mississippi. And the Kennedys had miscalculated, thinking that the segregationists would be okay with voter registration. So she and some of the others interested in direct action tried to build on the Freedom Ride's support work in Jackson and build a nonviolent movement in Mississippi. They called it Move on Mississippi, or MOM. As part of that, Nash was arrested for contributing to the delinquency of minors when people under 18 were arrested, or was it under 21? I can't remember. But she's when others are arrested for sitting in, she was charged with this. And in December 31st, 1961, she marries fellow activist Jim Bevel, something that caught most of her coworkers by surprise. And at just about the same time, Bevel left SNCC and went on to staff with SCLC. In many ways, it was probably a better fit for him. There was more room for charismatic leadership. There was better pay. And they were expecting a child, so this mattered to him, I think. And Bevel relocated to Cleveland, Mississippi, and he lived with NAACP activist and SNCC mentor Amzie Moore, working on voter registration. So that's the other irony, is within a couple of months, Bevel first, and then Nash are working on voter registration in Mississippi. So Nash follows him to the Delta of Mississippi, working on voter registration. She's married, she's pregnant, she has these charges hanging over her head. And in Hands on the Freedom Plow, which is a wonderful book with 52 accounts by SNCC women, edited by 6 SNCC women, Nash tells a compelling story about how in summer of '62 she made the decision not to appeal a Mississippi conviction and faced the very real possibility of giving birth to her first child while in jail. Though this was a personal decision that she reached through meditation, Nash notes that many people assumed her then husband Bevel had pressured her into that stand. She explains, quote, "When a number of people discovered that I was getting ready to go and serve the sentence, they would say, 'Oh, Reverend Bevel, you shouldn't make your wife do that. That's too much.' Even though both of us would say that he wasn't making me do it, some people were convinced that he was. I imagine these people thought a woman was incapable of making a decision like that on her own. Instead of considering me a person with a brain in my own relationship to the Creator, they thought of me only as the Reverend's wife." The judge eventually dismissed the charges, probably to avoid external scrutiny, but Nash did serve several days in jail because she refused to sit on the colored side of the courtroom, and she was denied the vitamins that she was taking for her pregnancy. She also describes the incredible fatigue she felt the night before she turned herself in, as Ann Braden, another movement worker and mother of young children, worked through the night to type up a statement and press release. After making the decision to go to jail, Nash issued a public statement asserting, quote, "This will be a Negro child born in Mississippi, and so wherever he is born, he will be born in jail." And despite the male pronouns, she gave birth a couple months later to a daughter, Sherry Lynn. I recently saw a letter that Diane Nash wrote to Anne Braden in 1962, thanking her for an article that Braden had written and mentioned Nash's daughter. And according to Nash, Nash told Braden that her husband, Jim Bevel, had suggested anytime she was facing charges, she should just get pregnant. And she seemed somewhat skeptical of that strategy. In summer of '62, Julian Bond, acting as SNCC's communication director, told people that Nash was on maternity leave. She made speeches for SNCC in Chicago and Detroit to help with fundraising, but really that summer marked the end of her close association with SNCC. After that, she more or less followed Bevel as he worked with SCLC across the South. Nash's experience with SNCC was unusual. I think it's still very important in suggesting that gender does matter, but not in the simplistic ways that it's often portrayed. It's clear to me that there was room in SNCC for her leadership, and that to the extent that she was marginalized at a certain point, it had more to do with her views on nonviolence, which were really out of favor with most in the organization, than her gender. And it's really her marriage and giving birth to her first child that moves her a little bit to the periphery of the movement and away from sort of the inner circle. I haven't had a chance to check this, but it sounds right to me. Andrew Young, in his memoir, wrote that while Bevel was on staff with SCLC, the organization treated Nash as if she were a minister's wife, expected to work without being on staff. He continued, quote, "No small measure of what we saw as Jim Bevel's brilliance was due to Diane's rational thinking and influence." And this is a little bit far afield from the SNCC story, though relevant. Later in the 60s, Nash was traveling in China, and Jim Bevel was home with their two children, and he had a vision about King and the need to protest the Vietnam War. So he follows King, I think, to Jamaica. He gets people to tell him where he is, and he pitches this to King that the organization needs to refocus on Vietnam. King says, "We're not going to do that, but if you want, I'll give you a leave and I'll hire Diane to do your job. Well, you go do this," which I think is indicative of the fact that people knew what was going on with that, in terms of the contributions that they were making. So I'm going to go back now to Nashville and sort of the sit-in movement when Nash emerges as a leader. Despite her obvious skill and effectiveness, the fact that she was not particularly interested in being a leader may have been part of the attraction for those who initially pushed her into that role. In this sense, the fact that she was a woman may have been important, though unacknowledged. David Halberstam, who covered the Nashville sit-ins as a young reporter for the Nashville Tennessean, later wrote that Jim Bevel identified Nash, they were not romantically involved at this point, as the obvious choice for leader, in part because she was the one person everyone would accept. Bevel thought that the young men at Fisk and Tennessee A&I would reject leadership from the ministerial students at American Baptist, which included himself, Bernard Lafayette, and John Lewis. Similarly, Lafayette reflected that after some initial jockeying, quote, "The men decided that we were not going to compete for leadership. We decided among ourselves that this was too important for us to be bumping male egos." Nash, he noted, quote, "because she was a woman and not a man, never had to go around and do any posturing." It appears then that Nash's leadership skills and her lack of leadership ambition were an ideal combination. In the context of the Nashville movement, which was full of skilled and ambitious men, Nash, as being a woman, and one seen as universally attractive, likely made her more, not less, acceptable. So, what do I want to do with my last 10 minutes? So there are a number of ways that you see some of the gendered expectations of the society influence what's going on in the movement. Initially, the gender-based campus rules and related assumptions could help contribute to a disproportionate male presence. So if you look at the first two SNCC meetings, the founding meeting in Raleigh in 1960 and then a follow-up October 1960 meeting here in Atlanta where the group was going to decide if it was going to continue or disband, about 2/3 of the student participants from the South are male, so overwhelmingly, or certainly disproportionately. The first coordinating committee meeting the month after the founding, all 9 of the representatives from each of the protest states were men. And so there's nothing at the very beginning that says this is going to be a place where there's space for women. And there are some things about, in addition to the fact that many traditional leaders on campus are men, there are also these gender-based campus rules and related assumptions that could help contribute to this disproportionate male presence. For example, Tom Gaither, is it Claflin? Claflin College student and one of the leaders in Orangeburg, South Carolina, explained that initially their movement had a, quote, disproportionate representation of guys because at the time girls could only be out of the dormitories until 7 o'clock or 7:30. So we had to communicate what we had done to the girls because they couldn't be there sitting with us. In Nashville, Diane and the other women would actually sneak out, and the men would help them climb out of windows or distract people at the front door while they're going in and out. Stokely Carmichael observed that the Howard University women who joined the SNCC affiliate NAG faced a very different set of cultural assumptions than did the men on campus. Some institutional prescriptions, cultural expectations, and social conventions affected women and didn't even remotely extend to men, and the curfews were only the most obvious. So very quickly, in addition to challenging segregation, people involved in the sit-ins are challenging what's going on their campus and are starting to be aware of these differences that they hadn't really thought about before. You start to see this coming up in terms of wearing hair natural, dress codes, all sorts of things like that. The sit-ins also came up against the traditional gender expectations that men should protect women. Chuck McDew remembers that about 30 students went on the second sit-in in Orangeburg, and when police threatened arrests, the students planned for 12 people to stay, all male, because, as McDew says, they had a sense of, quote, Southern chivalry and didn't want the women to be arrested. I have to follow up on this because I'm not sure if that decision was made by that all-male Orangeburg leadership. I suspect it probably was. While many people, women and men, struggled to maintain nonviolent discipline in the face of violence against themselves or others, this could be particularly difficult for men who were socialized to protect women and children. Charles Sharad, one of the first SNCC field secretaries in Albany, Georgia, implicitly addresses the cultural prescriptions that women needed protecting in his description of one of the first nonviolent workshops in Albany in October '61. In some ways, his account suggests that he viewed the participants' willingness to cross gendered boundaries as an indication of the movement's gathering strength. In a report to the SNCC office, he wrote, quote, that same evening, enthusiasm was the order of the day. We had some shocking demonstrations of nonviolence. A beautiful, young, slender, stacked lady and a tall, very dark, but not so handsome young man participated in a proposed act in which the male was to be the white brother of unrestrained anger and the young lady was to be a sit-inner. He was to strike her. He did, like all caps, bold, everything. Wow, you could hear the crowd raise together, a voice in moaning. One girl shouted aloud. It was something. So these accounts of gender and protection run all through a lot of the movement literature, and a lot of it focuses on women, but you also see, for example, Rodney Powell and Gloria Johnson, both leaders in Nashville sit-ins who were romantically involved, deciding that they couldn't be on the same demonstration team because they each felt like they would try to protect the other. But the focus generally was on women. Chuck McDew told an interviewer, I don't know if you've ever watched a high-powered water hose hit somebody. They're sort of tossed around like rag dolls. I remember being very conscious at the time of considerations of rupturing of girls. You know, how can you turn a hose with this pressure against the breast of a young lady? He recalls feeling, quote, very bad as people were being knocked down by fire hoses, but also that, quote, it was really necessary. The man wasn't going to stop hitting, so they had to confront him. But then he was arrested right away, so he wasn't getting hit with the fire hose. He's sitting in a police car and he saw a quote, sorry, no quote, young blind woman swept off her feet and separated from the student who had been guiding her. He tried to get out of the car to reach her and somebody, quote, slapped me around. The last thing I remember seeing before I was conscious later of being in jail was this girl trying to find whoever was guiding her. And he says later he saw pictures of this demonstration because, he was knocked out. He didn't see this. He saw pictures of the demonstrations and he saw one young man, David Jones, quote, holding this little blind girl, the same little girl that I'd seen knocked down under this blanket. He was sort of holding her to himself and had this blanket around his shoulders and around this girl. David's a very strong person, as strong as any man. And so then he goes on to say that David Jones is also 6'8" NFL Hall of Famer Deacon Jones. And, on the one hand, he's really describing this college-age woman as a very sort of needing, protected little girl. But he's also answering some of the critiques against men, especially for using nonviolence and not fighting back. You get this. And McDougall reflects, quote, thinking back now, it certainly takes a strong person to do that, a very strong person, above and beyond physical strength, to be able to say, cool it for a while, to something bigger, play the bigger stakes. Charlie Cobb, who spent several years working in the Mississippi Delta, initially in Sunflower County with Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, described nonviolence as practical and necessary for survival for those doing voter registration in the Delta. But he said that it was much easier for him to be nonviolent himself than to watch other people being attacked. He also recalls that initially in the Delta, all of SNCC's field secretaries were men. Very few, only a handful of people. And then they heard that Dory Ladner and Colia Liddell were going to be joining them, and this small group of men began discussing two related questions: whether they could maintain nonviolence if their female companions were attacked, and in light of this concern, whether the women should stay away. In recalling this, he laughs and adds that before they've gone very far in their discussion, Ladner and Liddell were in the Delta and working, and none of the men were going to tell them that they should leave. If any of you have met either of these women, you would understand. I asked SNCC Field Secretary Ivanhoe Donaldson about this, and he explained, quote, you see a woman get hit, and you suddenly want to go over there and gut the guy. Remember, my dad brought me up. His father was a New York police officer from Jamaica who had no use for his sons being part of this nonviolent movement. So there were times when everything in your body had to go into reverse to stop you from getting yourself killed. So it was a lot of that in SNCC. He elaborates, quote, we came through a history where black men allowed their women to be raped and beat up. And you can quibble with that, but that's what he says. And I was determined. I was never going to participate in something like that. And yet I was participating in something like that. Because all you can do in a demonstration when someone gets hit is to try to intervene with your body. But you also have to respect the right that they are co-partners in this, not a subsidiary kind of person that had to be nurtured and protected. As the sisters would say, they would protect us. And they did the work, so it was kind of hard to not get that message. So the sit-ins look one way, then when you start looking at work in the field, you start to get a slightly different picture. People talk about the first 16 people in SNCC to go full-time, and I have a sense of who that 16 is, and probably 13 of them were men. And very much in the field, the first people are male SNCC field secretaries. But as soon as community people get involved, you have women getting involved in greater numbers than men, women and girls. And so I could talk about this in Albany, in the Mississippi Delta, Albany movement, the Mississippi Delta. And so there's, and how it worked in those two places was different. One of the things I haven't talked at all about is sort of how SNCC goes from this group that's coordinating student protests on different campuses to this group of organizers. And really, on the one hand, you have a mostly male coordinating committee that gets together once a month or every other month and talks. But for the first few months, the person that's holding everything together is a young white woman from Virginia, Jane Stembridge, who's SNCC's first paid staffer. And she and Ella Baker and Connie Curry, who lives here in Atlanta, who was considered an adult advisor, really played a central role in shaping SNCC. So on the one hand, the visible layer is male, but behind that, most of the people that are shaping what's going on in the organization are female. And there's some interesting things about that. So why does, one of the things that's interesting, Diane Nash uses that male language to describe her child. But as early as December 1962, Bob Moses, who's SNCC's first field secretary in Mississippi, is actually using a female pronoun for sort of generic, to refer to people who would give them access to their home, or, so he would say, we can count on someone too, and then he'll use the pronoun she in a way that I've never seen anybody else do in that time period. So he's flipping to female pronouns for a generic person, I guess, if you will. Women in SNCC did not have one common experience. The patterns, I think, are an important starting place for understanding how SNCC and the young people both reflected the gender conventions of the day and defied them, ignored them, remade them. It was pretty clear, I think, from the, well, I don't know that it was clear from the sit-in, but by the time SNCC, no, I'm going to backtrack from that. Never mind. I was going to say that it was pretty clear that women were going to create this, but I think it was contested all the way through. One of the things I think that's important about thinking about how this happened, and that's one of the things I'm interested in that I didn't really talk much about today. But Ivanhoe Donaldson again said, quote, motion really sort of always governed in SNCC, and women ran out and ran projects and did stuff. Because we're having the discussion didn't mean we're either for it or against it. Motion defined what we did. And SNCC people stayed in motion and they did what they did. And it didn't stop the concept of the conversation, which was in some ways significant and important, but really it was the action that was pushing things forward. So I'll stop there so we have time for questions, and I can pick up some of this stuff and also mention some other things if there's time. Thanks.